Welcome back to our series on gospel-centered families and relationships. And in this 8th and final video, we're going to be looking at the 7th principle from Deuteronomy chapter 6, and that is the principle of remember. And specifically, remember the story. Remember God's story. We all love a good story, and we all love a good storyteller. At the heart of story or narrative, some people will call it, is the idea of remembering. And we tell stories and relate stories, and sometimes over and over again we tell the same story. Every year at Christmas, Papa tells this story, or Dad tells this story, or hey, tell us this story about this. Why? So we don't forget the story, because story provides such an important part in our lives. And so let's spend a few minutes reading this last part of Deuteronomy chapter 6. And I think you'll hear this whole idea of story in here. Chapter 6, verse 20 of Deuteronomy. In the future, when your son asks you, what is the meaning of the stipulations, decrees, and laws the Lord our God has commanded you? Tell them, we were slaves of Pharaoh in Egypt, but the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand. Before our eyes, the Lord sent miraculous signs and wonders, great and terrible, upon Egypt and Pharaoh and his whole household. But he brought us out from there to bring us in and give us the land that he promised on oath to our forefathers. The Lord commanded us to obey all these decrees and to fear the Lord our God, so that we might always prosper and be kept alive, as is the case today. And if we are careful to obey all this law before the Lord our God, as he has commanded us to do, that will be our righteousness. You hear the idea of story in there. Whenever they ask you, why do we do what we do? Well, here's why we do what we do. And he goes back 400 plus years and says, this is the story. This is why we do what we are, what we do, and who we are, what we are. Through story, we learn our history, where we came from, how we belong into things, and the meaning behind what we do. Why does your family do this? Well, that's just because of this, and there's history and there's story behind it. There's also expectations of what we're supposed to be. This is how we operate, this is what we're supposed to do, and you hear that in Deuteronomy 6. Therefore, this is what we do. Why do we do this? This is why we do this. At some level, our identity is shaped by our story. Now, that can go both ways in our lives. We might have a pretty rough story that we've been a part of, but it doesn't dictate that we have to repeat that story. Our story can take a diverging path, and that goes all the way back to the grace of God, and all of our paths are diverging from sin. And we see all this in this text in some way or another. Some of the principles for the nation of Israel that they had, where we came from. Abraham, Sarah, bondage to freedom. We were under all this stuff going on with Pharaoh, and the Lord's mighty hand did some great and terrible things, but yet here we are on the other side of it. What we do, we worship the one true God that leads to a blessing from God, and when your sons ask you, you tell them. You tell the next generation. That's what we do. How is it told? Through feast, through celebrations, through festivals. These rhythms and rituals that we've talked about previous all form a system of remembering that was built deep into the core of the nation of Israel so that they did not forget God. Ours is the same way. Stories we need to be able to tell our families and our friends and our forever family things so that people can know. One, our faith journey, how I became a Christian, where I came from, what my upbringing was, what I knew, what I didn't know, how I came to know the Lord. My spiritual journey, how I grew when I came to the Lord, and certain elements that shaped that and what was important to me. Setbacks that I experienced on my journey. Things where I messed up, seasons where I didn't do well, and how the Lord, through His mighty hand, helped me recover. how my life has changed from now to from where I was to where I am right now. That spiritual journey, our faith journey to the Lord and with the Lord, is important for people to know about us. So if you're a mom and dad and you have children, you've never told your children how you became a child of God and your faith heritage, or maybe the faith heritage that y'all are creating, tell them. They want to know. I promise you they want to know. If you're in a small group with people, I encourage you to take some time to be able to share how you became a child of God. We've done small groups here, and every week a person that was a part of that group shared their faith story to start the group. Beautiful to understand it. And the insights you gain from people, you're like, wow, I didn't even know that about you. And it really does share insight. And it is an encouraging thing to see how the Lord has worked in your life. From your own family history, your upbringing, especially if you have families or a part of a family and you want to know, it does help make sense of things. Where you're from, what part of the country you're from, or if you're from a different country, what was life like, and how did you get where you are? What was your family life? Would you have a mom and dad? Did you live with your grandparents? Was it a single parent situation? What were some of the ins and outs and things that were good and bad and maybe even ugly in your family that you feel comfortable sharing? And even maybe some of those things that you don't feel comfortable sharing. There's a lot of ins and outs and things that shape us that as we tell who we are and where we came from might reveal some blind spots that allow the Lord to work in our life and even heal from things. What was important in your family? What was important to you in your upbringing? What memories do you have in coming up, and how has that shaped how you operate right now? Why we celebrate and how we celebrate is very important. There are times that we can point to remember the story and how we tell that story. One, in the Christian community, and we alluded to this in a previous video, the Lord's Supper is a story to tell. We remember the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. We remember that night, that Passover night that he celebrated, and he fulfilled the Passover. All Passovers to that point, he became the fulfillment of that. And a new covenant was created that day by his blood and by his body. And we remember that, and we tell the story of Jesus. Our baptism, when we were baptized, the moments leading up to that, the days and weeks, the anticipation, the study, the thought that went into that. Tell that story. That's an important story in your faith journey. In our community, in our local West Monroe, North Louisiana community, Chip Night is a huge night that tells a story. No matter the color of chip or the number of year on my chip, that chip tells a story. Hey, 3 years, how did you get here? What does that blue chip mean to you? What does that white chip mean to you? That 30-day chip, how significant was that for you? Tell that story. And look, ask. If you're wondering, ask. Tell me how you got to your 4-year chip. Oh, wow. People want to tell the story. Be willing to listen. Giving. In my family, growing up, my mother was very generous. We were didn't have a lot of means, just kind of a middle-class family, but she was very generous and always giving. That became, and I asked, why do we give? Because it's the Lord's, and the Lord gave to us. And that's what we taught our children. We give because what we've been given belongs to God. Tell the story of giving so that they can remember why we give. Those cameras are rolling in people's heads. Singing, praying, community. Why we do what we do. Why do y'all show up on Sunday mornings and do this? Why do we sing these songs the way we sing these songs? Oh, that's an old song. Oh, that song's so old it is new. Why is that? Because this is what this means. There's meaning behind the story, and be willing to share those stories. They're important to tell. One, in a physical family, our story is important to tell in a physical family because it shares vital information about who we are as a family. There are things that happened in our family that were awesome, and we're going to repeat those. There were things that happened in our families that were not so awesome, and we're not going to repeat those, but we're going to learn from those. And as a husband and a wife from two different families come together and they create their own family and heritage, this is what we're going to do on purpose, and we're going to tell the stories to our family with this. In our forever family, the same is true. It can shed light into personality of who I am and how I operate. It helps us remember that the growth the Lord is working in our life when we tell the story. I remember when I had just become a child of God, and the first thing I did was I signed up for this small group, and I remember the people that were in it, and I remember this person said this to me. And then I remember that time where I slipped out for a while and things didn't go well. And I got this note from this person, and it prompted me to come back. And I still have that note to this day, and I tuck it in my Bible. And it helps me remember never to stray, and that I'm still loved and I still belong. It becomes a testimony. Our story becomes a testimony to God's grace. And really, our testimony, when we're called to remember the story, it is really remembering how God's story intersected with my story, and my story began to be shaped and reflect His grace and His story in our life. We all need to remember. We do not need to be forgetful people. Peter said that in his letter, that do not forget these things. If we do and we forget to grow, then we become nearsighted and blind and forgotten that we've been cleansed from our past sins. And we never need to be those people. Telling His story in our lives with our physical families. And this is how our family works and walks in the story of God. Telling our story with and remembering the story of God in our life with our forever family and the testimony that we give is a powerful thing to remember and see our growth and encourage other people. It is a powerful tool that God wanted us to use. Whenever your son asks you, tell him this. This is our story, and this is where we're going, and this is where the Lord is taking us. Thank you for being part of this series. Let's continue to dig in to what God has for us as we tell His story, and His story is still being written in our lives as we grow gospel-centered families and relationships.